Hey, Othon, just a quick thing before we really launch into it. I want the audience to fully understand. Was it Orban who actually embraced the term illiberal? I think he used the term early on, is what you said, and I think that's my reading.
There was obviously in this scholarly bibliography the term illiberal democracy there, but he was the first that used it as a political system within Europe in a very famous speech that he did in 2014 on how to create a liberal state within Europe, and taking examples from Russia and China as well.
Judy, thanks for hanging out with us. You expressed the inadequacy of Europe's embrace of, or its use of how it's using its soft power. But that makes people think, well, therefore, are you calling for the use of more hard power in dealing with these intractable issues?
Yes, the EU likes to pride itself on soft power and diplomacy. And as we have seen in the Western Balkans, we've seen in other countries, the soft power with any kind of serious security, defense, or intelligence underpinning, it doesn't go very far at all. And I think this is one of the great weaknesses. This is not a call to war. This is a call to actually make sure that diplomacy is supported by the instruments of hard power. France understands this. Britain, when it was a member of the EU, did. But in Germany, particularly the biggest EU country, simply just doesn't want to discuss the issue.
Othon, so what would, this is so unfair for me to ask, but if you were to help write a prescription for putting some backbone into Europe's desire to have all of its countries live by its own core values, you talked about lack of coercive methods at its disposal, other than kicking a country out of the EU, the nuclear option, as we would say in the US. What are things that Europe should consider to getting tougher with the countries that don't live up to what should be European values?
This is indeed a very difficult one, because there is a combination of politics and geopolitics in our current global environment. And so I can understand sometimes why there is a big dilemma in how the EU has to operate with the politics and how much critical it can be. I'll give you an example now, for instance. When the EU sees Poland being so receptive of all the refugees, the main border actually that is receiving the bulk of refugees from Ukraine, will the European Union want to be critical of rule of law problems in Poland? I mean, that is a very difficult question. But what I have found out in terms of how the European Union operates, I can understand the circumstances when these dilemmas become more difficult to address. But at the same time, there are gaps in how consistent the European is with its own political conditionality. So there is one thing, being constantly consistent that political conditionality matters and is not going to be sacrificed. And of course, in difficult moments, you have to, cut some corners. But at the same time, you just have to be consistently persistent that this is political conditionality that matters. And I tell you another thing, the case of Hungary, for instance. One of the reasons why Hungary also got away with it is because they had many votes within the European Christian democratic family. As long as Orban and his party Fidesz were part of the wider European Christian democracy, then they were dependent on his votes. They were the dominant kind of party family. It's a good thing that finally they just decided to cut the umbilical cord with him and let him go away. Obviously now he operates with the fringes, but he cannot go very far, obviously, with parties, of the extreme right. So there need to be some tough decisions sometimes, and not just a calculation of political cost. This is where I believe that the EU should definitely be consistent with its politics and political conditionality.
I had a question last night that's been repeated in a different form that I want to share with each of you. We've been talking about European Union core values. But Anna from University of Maine has a question about how does, in her perspective, the loss of religion as a unifying perspective in Europe affect the integration of the bloc? Is there another unifying ideology that could help unite nation states? And of course, this also plays out in the migration and refugee debate. But how do we start thinking about a question like that? Judy, you want to start?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question because, Anna, when you think of the French Revolution, which was so radically secular, and it has remained secular ever since, it has certainly shaped the French view on how on the construction of Europe in some ways. So each country has a very different religious tradition, forged through history, forged through, go back centuries. This is the first thing. Secondly, you have to also then consider the serious role, but declining, role of religion in Catholic Poland. While it's declining, it still is quite a force and it's being used by the ruling Law and Justice Party. And it can be manipulated in some ways as well, despite all the scandals in the Catholic Church over the past decade in Poland. But I wonder. Let me give you a third point. So I'm Irish, and religion dominated our lives in school, at home, on the weekends, and so on, and. It was a real, not a burden, but it inhibited a kind of free critical thinking. And so when we did apply to join the European Union, and we did join it, the religion became a really open discussion, and it just wasn't about pedophilia or what the priests were doing. It became an open discussion on how you link religious influence to human rights, whether it's divorce, whether it's separation, whether it's abortion, whether it's gay rights. And it became a very poisoned debate in the beginning. And then over time, it became an immensely mature debate. And I think Ireland has profited from this element of the decline of religion, which actually did suffocate discussion. This is not to say that religion as a personal and societal element, it is important for communities. And we've seen here the decline of church attendances in Germany, rapidly declining because younger people are going away from it. But there's no doubt that when religion does decline, the kind of communal community bonds do weaken. So there's a plus side and a negative side to this. But the bigger question, the loss of religion itself, does it affect the bloc? Orban would say yes, and so would Putin and others, but I don't think so. I think it's a deeper element of how the bloc has deep cultural, historical experience and different experiences of war and occupation.
Othon, you didn't mention religion, but I think you did appeal to some sort of set of core values that the European Union should have that it seems to stray from these days.
Now, it's interesting, and I'm going to turn this into a personal experience because half of my side is actually my formative years are in Greece, which is a country where religion is a very important issue of national identity. And having lived many years, recently got a British citizenship as well. I was forced to because of the Brexit. But living in a secular society, that is also my other side, where I believe that this society as well is very much at ease with itself in being secular and being quite liberal with the different religious traditions. And looking at the two different, obviously in the Greek case, you don't have religious fundamentalism there, or it's not as passionate, but it is part of the customs and the habits. And I believe it is for some European states it is part of their own culture and their national identity. That's something that cannot be suppressed, which is similar to a language that needs to exist. After all, this is the purpose of the European Union. Where I find the EU to be a little successful here is in the sense that it leads to the neutralization of the religious element within the European Union context. It doesn't and hasn't been using this element for any kind of purposes, even avoiding it into building this into the normative Europe, which is a good thing. On the other hand, when we see, the creation of directorates in the European Commission, like the European way of life, that unavoidably leads you to a civilizational component and a civilizational understanding of what Europe is about. And then it's not about, obviously, conflicts within the Christian religions themselves, but it does create the otherization of, Muslim religion in particular. That is something that, I don't know if any country manages basically to overcome this. It is something that exists, and with the refugee issue, that is becoming even more poignant.
Judy, you want to follow up, it looked like. Judy, did you want to follow up? Oh, you might be on mute.
Only joking.
There we go.
Othon, I think this is really very interesting. This European Commission for European Values, it's a kind of, it sometimes reminds me of the commissariat in the former Soviet Union. What we have to be very careful about is not to demonize religion, and to quietly or proclaim Europe as a secular bloc. I think it's actually denying Europe of its rich, deep Judeo-Christian traditions. And I think we have to, these are part of our bedrock of our outlook and our identity. And to ignore this or to substitute it with other different language, I think it's a grave mistake in trying to understand the nature of toleration among religions.
Betty Robinson, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Southern Maine, had a question. While, for instance, the American media has been reporting on elements of the far right in this country that's supporting Putin, I saw an early poll, a scientific poll, that said there's a fair degree of unity on the left and the right in the US, at least at the moment, of revulsion about what's happening in Ukraine. So that was my addition to Professor Robinson's question. She asks, any chance this invasion of Ukraine will have a positive effect on democracy and slowing this tendency toward illiberalism as people unite around taking a look at what its the most extreme examples will, the effect of that will, the situation that we'll be able to see before our eyes. What comes of that?
I think that's a very good question, actually, because the far right parties in Europe, they have a very big dilemma right now. On the one hand, they have been supported financially and in other ways by Russia, and indeed many of them have created personal links with Russian politics and Putin himself. So there's been that kind of connection between them. In a very recent meeting that they had in Madrid a month ago, I believe, they weren't able to make up a common statement regarding the issue of Russia's intention to invade, and they kind of escaped it. So it's very difficult for them, being nationalist parties as well that they are, to be able to explain that they are in favor of Russia in this very difficult instance. The thing with far-right politics, however, is that they are also very, very flexible. On the one hand, they're very rigid in terms of their ultra-conservatism, anti-migration, and their Europhobia rather than Euroscepticism. But on the other hand, they have the ability to make the most of a crisis environment in order then to play with one or the other alternative discourses. I'm afraid, we won't see them disappearing. But they are part actually of the political spectrum. It's very important they are kept in the fringes as much as possible. But more and more, we are seeing that they are part of the game. On the issue of Russia, definitely the question is that they have a very big dilemma. But to make them less illiberal, that's something that I don't think that is going to affect them.
Judy, any follow-up to that?
Mute. Yes, one follow-up. The question is really interesting. Why is it that the Europeans are so weak at promoting their values of democracy and of freedom of speech and of tolerance and of the rule of law? And Othon, not even going into your terrific lecture, let me give you an example. So RT, this Russia propaganda television, which is highly sophisticated, Germany has decided to not renew its license for many reasons, and so it's out of the picture from Germany at the moment. It was very insidious, but very professional, and there's a huge number of pro-Russian supporters here in Germany, especially in Eastern Germany. Is this the right way to deal with liberalism, by expelling instead of confronting head-on what we stand for? And we've seen the European Commission drag its feet over Poland and Hungary. But here in the middle of Europe, if we have to expel or deny license to a Russian propaganda station, what does this say about our inability to really support our values through the communications, through the social media, through town hall meetings, simply through a very intense kind of communication exercise? That's what intrigues me.
This came up last night when we had some questions about, Europe is taking a more proactive, shall I say, approach to regulating big tech companies, and where a lot of the propaganda, misinformation, and lies is propagated, and and how does that conflict with values of free speech and so forth? I think it's an interesting question. On this notion, interesting question from, let me just find it again. Saya Miles, she's a student at Piscataquis Community High School in Maine. She's worried about the terms that we use for these really important issues becoming debased. Democracy, as we know, illiberal places say we're democracies. Liberal, illiberal have become so misused, misunderstood, that is it time for some sort of redefinition or choosing some other vocabulary? Are those too broad or too limited in some way? I think it's an interesting question.
I'm afraid this is part of the scholarly polyphony. And in that sense, we will never be able to get rid of ourselves from all these terminologies that are created. Each scholar, each analyst points to one particular aspect of democratic politics. And if that doesn't function well, then, they give it a certain term. I think they all converge in one main idea, that there is, nothing straightforward in democratic politics. We know that it is the best form of government, so good that, as I said, authoritarian rulers also want to use it in their own vocabulary. But there are so many different, varieties of democratic politics that we are seeing in the European context to begin with, that I think it's very, very difficult to be able to come up with one particular notion that will be able to satisfy us all.
Lots and lots of questions here that I kind of just want to collapse it and just get some more discussion on it. There seems to be a sense of, I don't know, is it unease? The audience has a very strong sense, as Judy Dempsey does, that the immigration issue has not been addressed head on. and that even if the EU ambassador, we can accept that some progress has been made, some will disagree, in Europe, this is something that will be part of the world for decades, plural. And it's almost like another climate change issue. And of course, it's related to climate change as people move to escape uninhabitable areas. The immigration issue it is so large. Is it amenable to any kind of policy, or is it just going to be an increased pressure on the institutions of Europe as Europe absorbs or doesn't absorb people moving in?
Can I take this, Othon? I mean, the migration issue feeds into Othon's presentation about populism and the fear of the outsider. But this migration issue, it's astonishing. I mean, there are parallels with the United States. The United States is built on migration, and Europe is partly built on migration, especially Germany after World War II, when over 12 million ethnic Germans from Russia and the areas that were taken away from Germany were forced to flee to Western Germany then and settle there. So there is that history of migration. But I think this is a big debate in France now. The migration has become so tied to the Islam issue and to the Muslim issue. And we saw this with how the Belarusian regime instrumentalized these hapless, they weren't refugees, migrants who thought they could buy tickets in Turkey or Iraq and come up to an EU country. And Poland immediately reacted, so that Lithuania put up huge fences. It wasn't just the way the issue was instrumentalized. And I remember talking to the Poles and Lithuanians about this. They weren't us. They were foreign. They were different. They were Muslim. They're not part of our Christian tradition. And so the migration issue is become so difficult to deal with in Europe now, because it is so entrenched in us and them, the outsider. And I go back to my original talk that opening the doors to Ukrainians won't be a problem.
Can I add something, David, on this? Because I would like to say that there's definitely the identity, the civilization, or the cultural issue, and that cultural protectionism that has become even more important these days. After all, the European continent has been a continent of movement. I mean, historically, it's a pity that we don't see migration as in its continuum, because that's been part of Europe's story anyway. And, we never saw those kinds of uprisings and that kind of, emphasis that is given now at the rhetorical level. What I would like to point, though, is that there is also the socioeconomic aspect to this problem. And again, looking at the experience of Brexit, migration was the number one issue that, was the one that could be digested much more within this whole context of the referendum lies and aphorisms. The basis for that was much more socioeconomic in this country. It wasn't that cultural and civilizational. The reaction in Britain was about all those Poles that had arrived during the years of enlargement, all those Romanians. I mean, you could read in the newspapers, in the well-known newspapers like Sun, etc., that the whole of the population of Romania, 20 people, would all actually leave Romania and come and live in the UK. So it was much more, I think, than civilizational. There is that socioeconomic component as well, and that's why obviously the parts of England that were seeing themselves being outcast, or their lines in the NHS were being, by others. So there is that dimension, I think, which is very important to note.
Yeah.
Judy?
One quick point, if I may. It's interesting, Othon, that at this point the civilizational issue was not in Britain. It was just those East Europeans, and the fact that the Poles and the Bulgarians and Romanians were keeping the NHS functioning. That's the national health system. It was the other Europeans that were invading Britain. You don't get that kind of discourse here or in Sweden or Denmark now. It's changed completely to a civilizational one, and that's. It's terribly dangerous how this is unfolding.
Yeah, and at a time when we've done a lot of coverage of this, Europe's aging population, especially in places like Germany, require immigration to make the social safety net function, and and the economics of it require new people of working age. Interesting question. These are all interesting, but Stefano Tijerina, University of Maine, asked, "What's the responsibility of the European international business sector?" It's interesting, European international business sector, it may just be the international business sector. What's their responsibility in strengthening the institutions that fight corruption, as Judy described, or the democratic backsliding that Othon has been talking about? In other words, where are those voices?
Very briefly, a great question. Two elements here. One is the role of shareholders. They're becoming more vocal on transparency, on democracy and climate change. But on the other hand, when you're talking about big business, we're talking about these big business, particularly the energy companies, chemical companies doing business in Russia. And if they know it's corrupt there, the rule of law is very weak, the property rights is very weak, but they could actually be doing much, much more in actually trying to have an influence. They have had some influence in Ukraine, interestingly, but at the end of the day, these very powerful business lobbies don't want to take a political stance because they don't want to burn the boats with some of these regimes.
And there's this is not universal, of course, but there is a strong business lobby supporting Russia in its move.
There's an
in
enormous business lobby supporting Russia, and it's very interesting when I criticized how the business lobby were silent over what was happening in Belarus and the human rights in Russia and the banning of non-governmental organizations and the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader. I got a very stinging note from them saying I was in the pay of somebody else and I was writing fake news.
Can I add something on this? The business sector actually has an ambivalent kind of relationship to all this. On the one hand, and obviously when we speak of business sector in the different countries, it's a different kind of understanding how these operate. But on the one hand, obviously there is a sense that big businesses in the European environment, they want to work within an environment of rules and procedures. On the other hand, they can also be very flexible when they relate to outside countries, because obviously they know there that the rules are totally different. And in that sense, there is on the one hand a conflict between how China will conduct business in a certain part of Europe compared to how a European business will invest there. But there is also that, and it's interesting now with Russia in particular, where the decision, to block the resources of all those big, Russia money in the UK has been a very, very important. At the beginning, it was a weak reaction, very few names, very few banks. Boris Johnson was criticized, you're not giving anything in terms of sanctions. Now, they increased the number to make it more consistent. But I'll give you an example. There is a difficult decision, for instance, what's going to happen with Abramovich, who is the owner of Chelsea. I mean, that is actually, half of London is with Chelsea.
Just so people remember, the football team, right?
That's right. The football team, he is the owner of the football team Chelsea, and that would actually be a revolution maybe for many people in London, although they need to face that kind of question, for instance.
All right, short answers on a big topic, and then we'll go to a break. And by the way, if we didn't get to your question, we're not throwing the questions out. They will probably be germane to other sessions, and we'll try to get to them. But just this, to just maybe codify this historic moment in history that we're all talking. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Othon mentioned, it was the end of history. And then we entered the post-Cold War world. That was what we've all lived in. And if you're under 32 years old, that's the world that that's the only world that you've known. Have events of the past couple of days, is it the end of the post-world era and we've just entered something brand new? Or Othon, maybe you might argue that the move toward these illiberal systems was already the new phase. Well, what do you think?
I think that's a fantastic question, David, because I've been thinking a lot on how I've been looking at all these developments myself. I mean, I've written extensively on the impact of Russia, especially, in the Balkan region that I know also very well. And, me personally, I was always ready to undermine the threat, to always think that, the West is probably exaggerating the infiltration of Russia. I have to say that during the last 2 days, my conception of what's happening has, really been upset. I mean, there's a revolution inside of me in seeing things, really differently, in the sense that, first of all, this is a very, very big danger to our political system, to our geopolitics, to the way that we understand the European continent and the territory. So that's a very big threat. And also to the way that I understand defense as well. I mean, I'm a pacifist, and I was always thought that, countries spend more. At least I know in Greece that spends a lot of money on its defense. But now, we are expecting Ukraine, actually, since the West cannot get in with armaments and people, NATO actually, to help Ukraine, we are expecting Ukraine to fight for us, to fight the European war on its own. And that, leads me to believe that, first of all, there is a very real danger. And secondly, that defense matters. So I'm just looking at things totally different, to be honest with you.
So Judy, when the Camden conference of 2022 happened, is that when history ended again? And this is some new phase that started Thursday night?
Well, history never ends and societies are never static. But Russia's invasion and attack on Ukraine must finally make the Europeans get out of their comfort zone, that they could rely on the status quo, which they hoped would be permanent after the end of the Cold War in 1991. You cannot, sitting here, and for the audience out there, you cannot underestimate how for parts of the countries this is an enormous shock. Because somehow we thought there was this taken for granted attitude. Well, Russia won't do this. Oh, well, Ukraine is Ukraine. And the biggest letdown and the most depressing element of this appalling war is that for far too long, both the European Union and particularly Germany and France and Italy looked at our eastern neighborhood of Belarus, of Ukraine, of Armenia, of Moldova through the prism of Russia. Let's not upset Russia. Or we'll do this with Belarus, blah, blah, blah. But Russia, it was just psychologically that they accepted Russia's benign influence, geostrategic influence over the region. Well, it's no longer benign. And this is the big jolt. But from this perspective of the Camden Conference, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 is torn up. The post-Cold War era is torn up. And the Europeans finally better get serious about their own security, but serious about protecting their East European neighbors.
Judy Dempsey, Othon Anastasakis, thank you very much for your wisdom. This has really been important stuff. And hopefully we'll see more of you as the conference goes on.